My brother laughed when I got kicked out. So I bought the house next door. Those words sound like a punchline now. Something you'd see in a revenge story headline. But that rainy afternoon, as I stood on the porch with my teaching portfolio soaked through and my mother's favorite dishes shattered on the pavement, it was no punchline. It was the moment everything collapsed. My name is Lolita Buckner Innes. I'm 36 years old. And until last year, I was a tenured professor of literature and ethics at a liberal arts college in upstate New York. I spent over a decade teaching young minds how to dissect narratives, how to find truth in fiction, how to question systems of power. I thought I knew how to read people. I thought I knew how to read my own brother. His name is Marcus, and he's 3 years older than me. We were raised in New Canaan, Connecticut, in a modest but loving home by our mother, Camille, a former English teacher turned public school administrator, and our father, who passed away when I was 20. After his death, it was just the three of us. Marcus focused on business. I went deep into academia. And my mother remained the anchor between our two very different worlds. When she was diagnosed with early-onset Parkinson's in her late 50s, I didn't hesitate. I took a leave from teaching, packed up my apartment in Ithaca, and moved back to New Canaan to care for her full-time. I didn't expect applause, but I also didn't expect to be discarded. The doctors said she had 4, maybe 5 years of relative functionality. What they didn't mention was the emotional cost. My days blurred into routines of medication schedules, physical therapy appointments, and late-night episodes of muscle spasms that left her breathless and me helpless. At first, Marcus visited twice a month, then once a month, then only on birthdays and holidays. Always dressed sharply, bringing expensive flowers or organic soups. He never stayed to see her eat. He said he was busy with his consulting firm, that he was doing what he could financially, and he did send checks. I'll give him that. But money doesn't hold your mother's hand when she forgets how to use a fork. Money doesn't lift her out of the tub when her knees give out. Money doesn't read her the same poem every night because she doesn't remember you read it the night before. I gave up my job. I burned through my savings. I freelanced when I could. Mostly writing curriculum plans for online platforms. Nothing consistent. The house was ours. Technically, it had been transferred to Marcus years earlier for estate planning purposes. Something I didn't question at the time, because trust was still something I believed in. When Mom passed, it wasn't peaceful. It was slow and raw, and I was alone for most of it. Marcus arrived after her final breath, then gave a heartfelt speech at the funeral about devotion and family and letting go. I stood in the back in an old black coat with lint on the sleeve and shoes I hadn't had time to polish. 3 days later, I found him in the dining room, already meeting with a realtor. He didn't look surprised when I walked in. "I thought you'd be gone by now," he said, tapping a thick folder against the table like he was announcing the weather. I reminded him I had no job. No apartment. No place to land after 3 years away from the professional world. "You'll figure it out," he shrugged. "You always do." When I asked for a few more weeks, he said fine. When I mentioned Mom's writing desk and a few pieces of furniture I'd like to keep, he said everything in the house was technically his. When I tried to argue, he said I was making this difficult. That morning, I left for a coffee meeting about a possible adjunct role at a community college. When I came back, my books were in trash bags on the front steps. The guest room door was locked. My name had been removed from the Wi-Fi account. There was a note on the fridge in Kendra's handwriting, his fiancée, whom he hadn't even introduced to me until after Mom died, saying the kitchen would be renovated soon and that it would be easier if I kept my things in the garage. I stood there for a long time, holding my mother's old copy of Their Eyes Were Watching God like a shield, wondering how you can be erased from your own life without anyone blinking. A week later, I came home to find my clothes on the porch. My toiletries dumped in a cardboard box, and a voice behind me saying, "Clock's run out." "Lolita." Marcus was on the front step, smiling like he was doing me a favor. "You don't live here anymore," he said. "It's time you moved on." The rain started then, soft at first, then sharp and cold. He didn't offer an umbrella. Kendra watched from the hallway, arms folded, amused. I bent down to pick up my portfolio, just as the water soaked through the zipper. He laughed. Not a chuckle, a full-bodied laugh, like he was watching something deserved. That was the moment. Not the funeral, not the note, not even the eviction. That laugh was the moment everything I believed about family, about loyalty, about who I was. To the people I sacrificed for shattered, I didn't remember much about how I got from the front steps to the edge of town. Only that I was suddenly walking in wet shoes with a ripped tote bag full of damp paperwork and the metallic taste of humiliation lodged deep in my throat. Every step felt like proof of how far I had fallen. I had no car. I had let the lease go when I moved back to care for Mom. And public transit in New Canaan was practically non-existent. I thought about calling a former colleague but realized I hadn't spoken to anyone from academia in over a year. People had stopped reaching out after the second semester I took off. They probably assumed I'd chosen a different life. Some romantic sabbatical of caregiving and self-discovery. No one imagines you're standing under an awning outside a closed dry cleaner at dusk, watching steam rise from your breath while holding your last clean pair of socks in a plastic grocery bag. I called 3 budget motels nearby, but the rates were too high for more than 2 nights. And one refused to book me without a valid ID and credit card on file. My old bank account had been overdrawn for weeks, and the remaining balance from Mom's Social Security payout had gone toward her hospice care. I didn't even have a forwarding address. The next morning, I walked to the library and tried to log into my email. The public computer wouldn't recognize my old school login, and my backup Gmail was locked from inactivity. I stared at the screen like it might somehow recognize me, verify me, let me back into a version of my life that hadn't completely disintegrated. The librarian offered me a scratch paper card with a temporary guest code and a sad smile that I couldn't bear. I opened a new browser and started searching for rooms to rent in nearby towns. Something under $600. Somewhere with a door that locked, and maybe a desk I could write at. The listings made it clear what kind of places were in that range. Most were basement sublets, with thin walls and house rules that included no guests after 8 p.m. Or shared fridge space. Not guaranteed. One ad included a picture of a twin mattress on the floor with no sheet and a caption that read "cozy and minimalist." I almost laughed, but the sound didn't come out. By mid-afternoon, I sat on a bench outside the grocery store, where Mom used to buy flowers every Sunday. I hadn't eaten since the previous day, and even then it had been a granola bar I found in my coat pocket. A man in a blue apron walked past with a stack of tulips and asked if I needed help. I shook my head, and he didn't press. 5 minutes later, a small woman with graying hair and clear, almond-shaped glasses stood in front of me, holding a paper cup of hot tea. "Chamomile," she said, her voice calm and unhurried. "You look like you've had too many sharp edges this week." I took the cup without asking questions. The heat made my fingers sting, but I welcomed the pain. She sat beside me without invitation, unwrapping a butterscotch candy and popping it into her mouth, like we were old friends. "I'm Ruby," she said, then nodded toward the flower shop across the street. "That's mine." I told her my name, and nothing else. She didn't ask. For 20 minutes, we sat there in silence, watching cars pass and people live normal lives. Then she stood and said, "Come sweep the back room. If you're halfway decent and not crazy, I'll pay you cash." She walked off before I could answer. I followed her into a narrow shop with old tile floors and the faint smell of eucalyptus and lemon soap. She handed me a broom, pointed at a dusty corner behind a rack of fake ivy, and went back to arranging lilies. I swept. I didn't ask how much she'd pay, or whether she needed help again tomorrow. I swept because it was the first thing anyone had asked me to do that didn't involve grief, sacrifice, or guilt. At the end of the hour, she handed me $35 and a sandwich. "There's a boarding house on Birch," she said, wrapping the bills in a flyer for an upcoming garden club meeting. "It's run by a woman named May. She'll take cash if you don't cause problems." She turned back to her flowers. I didn't thank her right away. I just stood there, holding that sandwich, like it was the first solid thing I'd been given in days. That night, I slept in a room the size of a supply closet, with wallpaper peeling at the edges and a mattress that creaked when I breathed. I stared at the ceiling for hours, not crying, not praying, just breathing like someone who didn't yet know what survival was supposed to feel like. When I finally fell asleep, I dreamed of my mother's voice, reading from Baldwin's The Fire Next Time. Her cadence was soft but clear, the way she used to sound when she graded essays aloud. In the dream, she said, "You think your pain and your heartbreak are unprecedented in the history of the world. But then you read." I woke up with that sentence lodged in my chest like a flare I hadn't known I needed. I didn't know it then, but that quote would become the spine of what came next. Because I wasn't going to disappear. I wasn't going to let Marcus's laughter be the last chapter. The days that followed were made of silence, sweat, and small decisions that didn't seem important until I realized they were saving me. I woke each morning to the hum of a broken radiator and the rustling of old trees outside the window of that tiny room on Birch Street. May, the boarding house owner, was stern but fair. She said little, expected rent in cash by Friday, and didn't tolerate noise after 10. I respected that. There was comfort in knowing exactly what the rules were, even if the mattress sagged and the bathroom sink leaked when it rained. Every morning, I walked to Ruby's flower shop just after 7. She never said I was hired, never gave me a schedule. But the third time I showed up early, she handed me keys without ceremony and said I should start the coffee before the first delivery came. It wasn't glamorous. I unpacked crates of carnations, trimmed stems until my hands smelled like green water, swept pollen from windowsills, and repotted succulents that customers left behind when they changed their minds. But in that small space filled with scent and sunlight, something in me started to mend. I hadn't opened a book in weeks. My fingers itched every time I saw a poem printed on a mug or a line from Whitman etched into a planter. One afternoon, I stayed late to clean the back table and noticed a customer had left behind a pamphlet for a lecture series on moral philosophy and literature hosted by a community college 20 minutes away. The flyer had creases down the middle and a faint lipstick mark near the title, as if someone had pressed it into a purse without thinking. I tucked it into my coat pocket and forgot about it for 2 days, until I woke up from a nap and remembered Baldwin's words from my dream. I pulled out the flyer, ironed it flat with my hand, and stared at the lineup. One of the guest speakers was listed as Dr. Glenn Eyre Perry, a name I hadn't thought about in almost a decade. He was the one who encouraged me to pursue my doctorate in the first place. I didn't know if he would remember me, but I decided I'd find out. I showed up to the lecture wearing the same black coat from Mom's funeral, shoes freshly scrubbed, and a notepad tucked under my arm like it meant something. The room was small, filled mostly with older adults and a few curious students. Glenn looked older, grayer, but when he saw me, his face broke into that half-smile I remembered from office hours. After his talk, I waited by the door. "Dr. Innes," he said, voice warm but surprised. "You look like someone who's been through a novel's worth of chapters." I didn't explain. I just said it was good to see him again. He offered to meet for coffee the next week. I accepted, even though I didn't know how I'd afford it. That meeting turned into something more. He didn't offer me a full-time job or a magical return to academia, but he did connect me to someone in need of curriculum consulting for an adult education program. The pay was modest, the hours inconsistent, but it gave me something I hadn't had in months: intellectual footing. I came alive during those sessions, even when I taught over Zoom in the corner of Ruby's shop, trying to keep my voice steady while a delivery driver banged through the back door. I taught one module on ethics in storytelling and found myself quoting lines I thought I had forgotten. Students asked questions that challenged me, and I answered them like someone who still believed in words. Meanwhile, Ruby offered me more hours. And not just for cleaning. She asked me to help reorganize her customer database, then design a flyer for a wedding package she was launching. When I told her I used to teach writing and design curriculum for literature courses, she didn't blink. She just asked if I could update her website next. I said yes before I even knew how much she'd pay. The act of saying yes felt like a muscle stretching after too long in a cast. One afternoon, as I watched her string fairy lights along the window and hum a Billie Holiday song under her breath, I realized I was no longer moving just to survive. I was building something, even if it was still fragile. Then came the day I passed by my childhood street again, the one I had avoided for weeks. I told myself it was coincidence, but I knew it wasn't. I slowed near our old house and saw Kendra on the front lawn, shouting instructions at a crew installing a new privacy fence. It was tall, white, artificial looking, the kind of fence that says more about who you want to keep out than who you are. I kept walking, but not before I noticed a small sign stuck into the grass next door. For sale by owner. The house belonged to the Masons when we were kids. I had eaten popsicles on that porch. I had helped them rake leaves when Mr. Mason had back surgery. The windows were faded. The roof needed work. And the bushes were overgrown. But the bones were solid. My feet kept moving. But my mind didn't. That night, I couldn't sleep. The image of that house hovered behind my eyelids. And a sentence took root in my thoughts before I could stop it. If he can own that side, why can't I own this one? I didn't tell anyone about the house at first. Not even Ruby. The idea felt fragile, like something that would vanish if I said it out loud too soon. But once it landed in my mind, it wouldn't leave. Every time I walked past the Mason house, I imagined what it would look like with new paint. Clean windows. Maybe hydrangeas in the front garden, like Mom used to plant. I pictured myself sitting on that porch, watching the street I had grown up on. Not as someone pushed out, but as someone who had chosen to return on her own terms. The irony didn't escape me. Marcus had taken what was familiar and weaponized it. Made our family home into a symbol of control and erasure. But the house next door that was neutral ground, it held its own memories, but none that belonged to him. I wasn't interested in revenge. I just wanted my own space, my own proof that I could rebuild. The listing was modest. The asking price was higher than I expected for a property in that condition. But New Canaan was still New Canaan. And people would pay for the zip code. I asked Ruby if she knew the owners. And she said the Masons had moved to Florida last year. Their nephew, a man named Eric, was handling the sale. He comes in sometimes to buy eucalyptus, she added. Like that explained everything. I wrote down his name and did what I always did when facing a problem I didn't yet know how to solve. I researched. I stayed late at the library reading about first-time homebuyer programs, unconventional financing, and community-based lending options. I learned that my freelance work could be considered income if properly documented. I found out that certain state grants existed for educators looking to purchase property in the towns they worked in. It wasn't much, but it was a start. One evening, after wiping down the flower shop counters and restocking the ribbon drawer, I opened my laptop and created a spreadsheet titled North Star. That was what the house had become. I listed every possible source of income. Ruby's payments, the teaching gig from Dr. Perry's contact, a small check from an old online essay that had recently gone viral again, I opened a new bank account at a local credit union and told myself I wouldn't touch a cent of it unless it was for that house. Every dollar went into it. From tips at the shop to refunds from canceled subscriptions I no longer used. I canceled my streaming services, stopped buying coffee on the way to work, and walked everywhere I could. I didn't tell myself it would be easy. I told myself it would be worth it. One afternoon, as I passed the house again, I saw a man in his 30s on the porch with a clipboard and a phone pressed to his ear. I guessed he was Eric. A looked efficient, detached, the kind of person who had already shown the house a dozen times and would show it a dozen more. I considered introducing myself, but something held me back. I didn't want to make a move until I had something real to offer. I took a picture of the real estate number and called it the next morning, pretending to be an interested buyer. A polite woman answered and asked if I'd like to schedule a showing. I said I'd get back to her. What I really needed was to understand what I was up against. That weekend, I signed up for a financial literacy workshop held at a local community center. The room was half empty, the fluorescent lights too bright, and the coffee stale. But the speaker, a young mortgage advisor named Jordan, was clear, confident, and refreshingly honest. After the session, I stayed behind and asked a few questions about mixed income documentation and unconventional mortgage approvals. He didn't flinch. He told me to come by his office that week and bring everything I had. I did, and over the course of 2 hours, I laid out every invoice, every payment stub, every document I could find. He nodded, made notes, and said something I hadn't expected. "This is messy, but it's workable. You've got history, discipline, and a clear target. That's more than most." I left his office with a folder of homework and the first sliver of realistic possibility. In the following weeks, I adjusted my hours at the flower shop to make room for more curriculum projects. I accepted every opportunity that came, even if it paid little, because every small invoice added legitimacy to my paper trail. I logged each payment, uploaded receipts, saved every email confirmation. I learned the language of mortgage pre-approval, of escrow, and inspection clauses. I started keeping folders labeled by category: income proof, personal statement, purchase intent. I wasn't just hoping anymore. I was planning. And in the quiet of those evenings, after long days of floral arrangements and ethics modules, I began to imagine the day I would walk through that house, not as a visitor, not as a tenant, but as its owner. I didn't care if Marcus noticed. I didn't need him to understand. What mattered was that I knew I was no longer surviving. I was moving with direction. And for the first time in a very long while, I was doing it for me. By early spring, the for sale sign in front of the Mason house had faded from sun and rain, but the listing was still active. I kept track of each price adjustment, like it was part of a syllabus I had to memorize. Meanwhile, the flower shop was busier than ever. Ruby hired a second part-timer to help with deliveries, which freed me up to focus more on the business side. I redesigned her entire booking system, created a new brand kit for the store, and started handling email campaigns that actually brought in customers. She paid me more than before. And once a week she left a small envelope near the till with a handwritten note and an extra $20 bill. I never asked for it, but I never turned it down. I was still living at May's, still using the same chipped mug and sleeping under the same too-thin blanket. But now I was also keeping a binder labeled offer packet with every updated financial document I could gather. Jordan and I met every other week to update the numbers. He never overpromised. I've never acted like he was doing me a favor. He explained things plainly, gave me options, and never once looked at me like I was foolish for trying. Somewhere between loan simulations and interest rate forecasts, we started having coffee after meetings. Nothing romantic. Not yet. But there was something honest about him. Like he didn't need me to be impressive. Just consistent. And I was. For the first time in years, I was consistent, grounded, even a little dangerous in how quietly focused I had become. Then one afternoon, while I was pruning potted rosemary in front of the shop, I saw Marcus's car, black, gleaming, and parked right in front of the Mason house. He stepped out with Kendra, dressed in head-to-toe beige like she had just stepped off a lifestyle blog. They walked the perimeter slowly, pointing at windows, gesturing toward the yard. I ducked behind a planter but didn't move. I needed to see this. Marcus stopped at the side fence, squinted up toward the chimney, and took out his phone, probably calling the agent. Probably thinking about offers and expansion and that ridiculous home gym idea he once mentioned, over brunch with friends who barely remembered my name. I watched them linger for 20 minutes, then drive off without looking around. They never saw me. That night, I didn't sleep. The idea that he might buy the Mason house, the only place on that street, untouched by his entitlement, made my chest tighten. I imagined him tearing out the walls, flattening the garden, putting in a pool with Bluetooth speakers that blasted curated playlists. Worse than that, I imagined him doing it because he knew I wanted it. Because he had always treated power like a sport and cruelty like a strategy. I didn't say anything to Ruby. I didn't change my plan. But I did text Jordan and ask if we could meet sooner than scheduled. He said yes. Of course. At the coffee shop, I explained everything I had seen. Jordan stayed calm, took notes, and then asked a question I hadn't expected. "Do you think your brother knows you're trying to buy it?" I said. I didn't think so. I'd told no one. Not even Ruby. Not even May. But then, I remembered the crew installing that tall fence. And the Wi-Fi password he changed weekly when I still lived there. The smug tone he used every time I asked for time or space or decency. "If he doesn't know yet," I said, "he'll find out soon." Jordan nodded and leaned back, eyes narrowed slightly in thought. Then we move quickly, quietly. We build a case that's hard to dismiss. He began outlining strategies, letters of intent, character references, ways to emphasize community impact to the seller. I wasn't the highest bidder. That was obvious. But I could be the most meaningful buyer. Someone who knew the neighborhood, who would live in the house rather than flip it, who had already contributed to the local economy and cared about preserving its fabric. That kind of narrative mattered more than people thought, especially to individual sellers. It wasn't a guarantee, but it was leverage. I went home that night and started writing a letter to Eric Mason. Not as a potential buyer, but as someone who used to climb his family's front steps barefoot after playing tag in the street. I told the truth, plainly and without drama, because I didn't need to exaggerate what I had already lived through. A few days later, Ruby handed me a delivery slip for an address on Walnut Lane. I glanced at it and froze. It was Marcus's house. I considered saying no, asking her to send someone else. But then I remembered the way he laughed as my life lay soaked in the rain. And I said, "I'll take it." I walked up to the door carrying a vase of blue delphiniums and a note addressed to Kendra. She opened the door halfway. I'm surprised to see me, but too proud to let it show. "Well," she said, "look who's still in town." I smiled politely and handed her the flowers without a word. She took them, looked down at my name on the card, and said, "You're working at Ruby's now. How? Small." I didn't respond. I just turned and walked away, knowing full well that the house she was standing in wasn't the only one I was watching. By the end of that month, something inside me had shifted. The fear that used to rise in my throat whenever Marcus's name came up had flattened into something else calm, almost clinical. I wasn't scared of him anymore, because he no longer held anything I needed. He had the house I once lived in, yes, but he no longer had control over the story I was writing. And what he didn't know was that I was finally ready to turn the page. Jordan had helped me pull together a full loan application, pre-approval documents, income statements, and personal letters. I had reference notes from Ruby, from Dr. Perry, and even from May, who didn't believe in complimenting anyone unless it was in writing. The offer packet was complete. All that was left was timing. A few days later, I got a call from Eric Mason. He said he had reviewed my letter, that it was unusual but thoughtful, and that he appreciated my honesty. I listened in silence, trying to read between the lines of his tone. Then he asked if I could meet him at the house later that week for a walkthrough. I said yes, of course, and thanked him without sounding too eager. When I arrived, the house was quiet, dustier than I remembered, but the bones were good. The front door stuck a little, and the floorboards creaked under uneven weight, but I could see what it could become. I asked questions about the roof, about the heating system, about the history of repairs. Eric answered everything clearly. Before I left, I handed him a sealed folder with my official offer inside. I said it might not be the highest bid he would get, but it would be the most committed. He nodded and said he'd be in touch within a week. What I didn't expect came 2 days later. I was at the flower shop filling out an invoice when Ruby walked in from the front, her eyes sharp. "Your brother," she said, "was here earlier." I froze. He asked if I knew anything about the house next door, said he heard it might sell soon and wanted to get ahead of it. I asked if she told him anything. She raised an eyebrow. I told him I sell flowers, not gossip. He didn't look pleased. My stomach twisted. If Marcus suspected I was involved, it'd move quickly. He had the money, the realtor connections, and the arrogance to assume he could close any deal. I stepped outside, heart pounding, and called Jordan. He didn't hesitate. "We submit it today. No delays. No second guesses. If he's serious, he'll offer cash. But you've already made your case, and it's a good one." That afternoon, I signed every line with a pen that shook only slightly in my hand. I scanned the documents, attached them to an email with a subject line that read simply, "Formal offer, Buckner Innes," and hit send. Then I closed my laptop and walked down the street in the opposite direction of my childhood home. I didn't look back. The next 48 hours passed like fog. I kept working, kept answering emails and sweeping petals and restocking eucalyptus. But inside, I was waiting for the shoe to drop. Then, on the third morning, just as I was unlocking the flower shop, my phone buzzed. It was an unknown number. I answered, voice steady. Eric's tone was warm, measured, and direct. "I'd like to accept your offer, pending inspection and financing approval." For a full second, I didn't respond. Then I thanked him, wrote down the next steps, and hung up slowly. I stood in the middle of the sidewalk, blinking into the morning sun, and felt something I hadn't felt in years: certainty. Not hope, not relief, but a quiet, undeniable certainty that I had done this for myself. What I didn't know yet was how Marcus would react when he found out. But the moment came sooner than expected. That weekend, while I was helping Ruby rearrange display tables for a bridal consultation, May walked into the shop, holding a newspaper and a thin smile. "Page B3, she said, handing it to me. There it was. A short column in the real estate section announcing a pending offer on the Mason house, noting that the buyer was a local educator and creative consultant. Marcus would see it. He read the papers. He always liked to stay informed, especially about things he thought he owned by proximity. That evening, as I was locking up, I saw him standing on the sidewalk across the street, hands in his pockets, jaw clenched, eyes fixed on the house next door to his. He didn't call out. He didn't walk over. Just stood there, like someone trying to make sense of a version of the world he hadn't approved. I didn't acknowledge him. I turned the key in the door, adjusted the sign in the window, and walked home. 3 days later, he finally showed up. I was locking up the shop early for a delivery when I saw his car again. Same polished black exterior. Same quiet smugness in the way he parked right in front, like he still owned the street. He didn't say anything at first, just stood there with his hands in the pockets of a coat that probably cost more than my entire rent for the year. I waited, gaze in hunt, body still. He looked at me the way someone looks at an unexpected invoice, annoyed, inconvenienced, vaguely insulted. "So it's true," he said. "You're buying the Mason house." I didn't respond. There was nothing to deny. He already knew. "You didn't think to mention that when we last spoke," he continued, as if I owed him a progress report on my life. I met his eyes and said quietly, "I didn't think it was your business." That seemed to shake something loose in him. For a second, he looked like he might say something real, but then he smiled. And it wasn't kind. "That house is a money pit. You know that. Right. Old plumbing. Bad insulation. Sloped foundation. You're buying a headache, just to make a point." I didn't blink. "No," I said. "I'm buying a home. Something you forgot how to respect." He scoffed and walked away like the conversation bored him. But I knew better. I'd seen that flicker in his face. The slight tightening of the jaw. The way his hand curled around his car key, just a little too tightly. He was furious. Not because I was buying a house, but because I was buying a house next to him without needing him, without asking his permission, without even giving him the satisfaction of a confrontation. That night, I told Jordan everything. He wasn't surprised. "Don't underestimate what insecure men will do to regain a sense of control," he said plainly. "Just be ready." And he was right. 2 days later, I got a call from Eric Mason, calm but firm. He told me that another offer had come in significantly higher. All cash. No contingencias. I asked if the buyer's name was Marcus Innes. He paused, then confirmed it was. My stomach didn't drop. I'd expected it. Eric said he hadn't made a decision yet. He still respected my commitment, my letter, and my connection to the community, but he had to consider all offers seriously. I thanked him for his honesty and hung up. I sat with that news for exactly 1 hour, then called Jordan. We met that evening in his office and went over every option. We couldn't match Marcus's cash offer. That was a fact. But what we could do was reinforce everything else: the financing approval already in place, the backing of local business owners, the personal letter, the references. Jordan suggested I record a short video message for Eric, explaining why this house mattered, not just as real estate, but as a part of my story. I filmed it that night, sitting in the quiet of my rented room, with nothing behind me but a lamp and a bookshelf missing its bottom row. I didn't cry. I didn't dramatize. I spoke plainly. I told him I wasn't trying to win against anyone. I was trying to build something for myself. After losing nearly everything, I ended the video by saying, "Sometimes home isn't where you're from. It's where you choose to return with purpose." 2 days passed without a word. Then Ruby told me Marcus had stopped by the shop again. This time with Kendra. Hadn't said much. I just asked whether the flowers in front were locally sourced, as if trying to act like a concerned neighbor. Ruby saw right through it. She said he lingered too long in front of the shop, like someone waiting to be noticed. I didn't react. Let him wait. That evening, as I was closing my laptop, a message from Eric popped up in my inbox. The subject line was simple: "Offer accepted. Contingent on final approval." My breath caught. I opened the message and read the details 3 times before I let myself believe it. He had chosen me. Not the cash. Not the fast closing. Me. I didn't text Marcus. I didn't walk past his house. I didn't update my social media or make an announcement. I simply called Jordan, thanked him, and began preparing the next round of paperwork. I printed every form carefully. I signed each page with steady hands and dropped them off at his office without ceremony. That night, I walked the block slowly, letting the quiet settle around me. The Mason house looked exactly as it always had worn. Quiet. Waiting. But to me, it was already changing. Not because the siding was different, or the lawn was trimmed, but because for the first time in a long time, I knew I wasn't standing outside, something I had lost. I was standing in front of something I had reclaimed, piece by piece, without rage, without begging, without permission. And that was something Marcus would never understand. The day the sale closed, it rained. Not a dramatic downpour, just a quiet, soaking drizzle that made the streets smell like wet cement and old leaves. I walked to the closing office with an umbrella that had a small tear in one corner and shoes that were probably better suited for spring. I didn't dress to impress. I didn't bring anyone with me. I sat across the table from the notary and Eric Mason, signed every page with the same name that used to be written at the top of my school report cards, and handed over the cashier's check like it was an extension of my spine. Eric shook my hand and said, "This house is going to mean something again." I said thank you. I meant it. I didn't celebrate that night. I didn't post a picture holding the key, or pour champagne or play music in the empty rooms. I walked through the house quietly, one room at a time, touching the edges of door frames and cracked windowsills like they were old friends I hadn't seen in years. There was a dusty piano left behind in the front room, out of tune and missing a few ivories. I sat on the bench, didn't play a note, just let the silence stretch. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't rushing to prove anything. I was just there. Later that week, I brought over a folding chair and a small lamp. I sat by the front window at dusk and watched the house next door light up, one room at a time, just as it had my whole childhood. Marcus's schedule hadn't changed. Still came home late. I still kept the porch light on all night. I still had his assistant pick up his dry cleaning in a black sedan that never parked more than 4 minutes. But this time, I didn't flinch when I saw the headlights. I didn't wonder whether he would come over, or if he'd try to reclaim the narrative. He didn't. Not directly. But I noticed a few things shift. The curtains on the west side of his house stayed drawn now. The neighbor who used to wave at me when I walked past with groceries suddenly avoided eye contact. And Ruby told me that Marcus had called her florist line anonymously, asking about a custom arrangement for an inconvenient occasion. She didn't take the order. I spent the next month moving in slowly. I didn't hire movers. I brought things one carload at a time. My books, my plants, my framed photographs that had spent the last 3 years in boxes marked weight. I painted the kitchen cabinets with leftover sage green I found on clearance, scrubbed the bathroom tile until the grout came back to life, and patched the hole in the hallway with help from a retired carpenter named Joe, who lived 3 doors down and used to fix things for my mother when Marcus was too busy. Joe didn't ask why I was back. He just handed me a bucket of joint compound and said, "You've got good bones. So does the house?" One morning, while hauling an old rug to the curb, I caught a glimpse of Marcus standing on his balcony, phone in hand, mid-conversation. He saw me but didn't wave. I didn't either. The distance between us wasn't about spite anymore. It was about clarity. We both knew I wasn't that girl who cried in the stairwell when he told me I had no place left in our family. I was the woman who now owned a piece of the block we grew up on and wasn't asking to be seen. The new neighbors started trickling in. 2. A couple named Danny and Petra moved into the corner unit. Both writers. Both warm. They brought over fresh bread and asked if I'd like to join a book circle. They were starting like... I said yes. Eventually, it felt human again. Choosing what to be part of. Ruby came over one Saturday with fresh lavender and strong coffee. We sat on the porch with our legs up on milk crates and didn't talk about Marcus at all. She just looked at me and said, "You're not walking like you're scared anymore." I smiled. Not because she was right, but because I hadn't noticed. I didn't have a master plan for what the house would become. I just knew it wasn't a weapon. It wasn't revenge. It wasn't a chess move. It was a place I could make decisions from. A place I could exhale in. And that, after everything, was enough. A few weeks after I'd fully settled in, the cracks started showing next door. It was subtle at first. A missed trash day. Weeds growing along the edges of his once manicured lawn. An unfamiliar car, parked in front overnight, that looked out of place beside his polished routine. I didn't pay attention initially. I had lavender to prune, a leaky faucet to fix, and a shop that had started gaining traction, thanks to word of mouth and Ruby's quiet promotions. But then, one evening, as I was closing my upstairs windows for the night, I heard shouting through the thin summer air. Not violent, but sharp, controlled rage, trying not to spill. Marcus wasn't the type to raise his voice in public. But that night, Ed did. I couldn't make out every word. But I heard enough. Something about control. About people not listening anymore. About how things used to be done. The voice that responded was calm. Female. Firm. Then silence. Then the front door slamming hard enough that my picture frames rattled faintly on the wall. 2 days later, a U-Haul appeared in his driveway. I watched through the side blinds as a young woman packed the passenger seat of her Prius with what looked like framed degrees and a laptop stand. She didn't glance toward my house once. I didn't ask Ruby about it. But she came by anyway that evening. She brought cinnamon bread and a folder of invoices. We talked about upcoming orders, supply shortages, and local vendors. When the conversation stalled, she said quietly, "You know he's not as untouchable as he thought." I didn't answer. Not because I didn't agree, but because I wasn't celebrating his unraveling. I had been there before. The loneliness after everyone walks out. The echo of your own ambition, turning into noise. I knew what it looked like when people began stepping back, not because they hated you, but because they were done being small around you. The next week, I hosted a small gathering at the house. Nothing dramatic. Just a soft opening for neighbors. A few creatives from the co-op space downtown. Some of Jordan's team. I cooked too much. Burned the edges of the bread pudding. And forgot to put out spoons. But people stayed late. Laughed loud. Asked questions about the paint colors and old photos on the mantel. It felt easy. For once, I wasn't watching the door. I was in the room. Around 9. As we were winding down, I saw him. Marcus, standing on his own porch, hands in pockets, watching. Not in anger. Not in jealousy. Just watching. I didn't invite him over. I didn't wave. I closed my curtain slowly and went back to refill someone's tea. That night, as I wiped down the counters and packed leftovers, I realized I hadn't thought of him once during the party. He stopped showing up at the flower shop. Ruby told me he'd canceled the standing order he used to place for corporate events. She wasn't surprised. "He's retreating," she said. "You didn't knock him down. You just stopped playing." That phrase stuck with me. I had spent so long trying to fight his noise, to rise above it or push against it. But maybe the real shift happened the moment I stopped needing to be louder than him and simply chose to live differently. To reclaim space without demanding recognition for it. A month later, I received a letter in my mailbox. No return address. Just my name in ink, I recognized immediately. Inside was a short note from Marcus. No apology, just a few lines. "I see the house suits you. I didn't think you'd follow through. I underestimated you. I won't make that mistake again." I folded it neatly, placed it in the back of a drawer, and left it there. That was the first time he acknowledged I wasn't background. That I wasn't just someone orbiting his gravity. And yet, it didn't feel like a victory. It felt like a release. I spent the next day sanding the back deck, hands covered in dust, shoulders aching in a good way. The house was quiet, grounded. Mina, I played soft music through a portable speaker and let the light fall through the trees in patterns across the old floorboards. Somewhere in that rhythm, in that physical labor, I realized something deeper had shifted. I wasn't angry anymore. Not at him, not even at the years I lost. They brought me here. They taught me how to build without permission, how to heal without applause, how to return without begging to be let in. One Sunday afternoon, just before fall settled in for real, I sat on the front porch with a mug of black tea and the faint scent of rosemary from the garden below. The wind had that softness only October brings, the kind that makes you feel like you're in a pause, not an ending. Across the lawn, Marcus's blinds were drawn. No movement. I hadn't seen his porch light on in days. It used to glow like a beacon every night, as if he couldn't stand the dark touching his property. Now, the shadows were welcome. Or maybe he'd just stopped trying to outrun them. I looked around the porch I'd built with my own hands. The second-hand rocking chair I'd reupholstered in deep plum fabric, the wooden planter boxes I'd carved initials into when I was still figuring out what it meant to reclaim something instead of replacing it. Inside, the radio played a jazz record low and steady, and the house smelled like lemon oil and something warm baking. There was no dramatic music playing, no audience applauding my comeback. Just silence, and peace, and a small, sharp knowledge that I had rewritten the script without asking permission. When I first bought the house, I told myself it was about proving a point, that he shouldn't have laughed, that he shouldn't have turned family into audience, then judge, then executioner. But sitting there now, I realized it wasn't about him anymore. It hadn't been for a long time. It was about space, my own, physical, emotional, professional. I didn't need to be the loudest person in the room. I just needed a room where I could hear myself think again. People still asked questions when they found out the story. A few clients from the flower shop who knew Ruby, a couple of neighbors who had lived here long enough to remember the yelling. They'd ask, in whispers, "So do you talk to him now? Or do you regret moving in next door?" And I'd always answer the same way. I don't talk to him, but I don't regret it. I needed to be that close to the wound to learn how not to let it own me. Sometimes, distance isn't measured in miles. It's measured in growth. My brother never apologized. Not directly. That one letter was the closest thing to an admission I ever got. And I've accepted that some people never say the words out loud. Some people never think they need to. I've stopped waiting for the reckoning. It's not that I forgave him in some noble, cinematic way. It's that I finally understood he wasn't the judge of me. His silence didn't mean I was wrong. His laughter didn't mean I was weak. His success didn't mean I failed. And my comeback didn't need to be a confrontation to be real. Later that week, I found myself walking through the backyard with a small clipboard and a pair of garden gloves, making notes on what needed pruning before winter. I paused at the old oak tree that sat right between our two properties. When we were kids, we used to climb it together. I remember getting stuck halfway once, my foot wedged between two thick branches, panicking until he climbed up after me. That version of him feels like someone I used to know in another lifetime. I left the tree alone that day. It didn't need shaping. It was old, steady, and quiet. It had survived all kinds of storms without needing to explain itself. A few nights later, Ruby stopped by again. She brought a bottle of cider and a newspaper clipping that had mentioned the shop in a small business spotlight. We toasted quietly and watched the sky turn to charcoal. She asked me, out of nowhere, "Do you think he ever understood what he lost?" I thought about it for a moment, then replied, "Maybe. Or maybe he just noticed what I gained." We didn't talk more about it after that. Some answers don't need to be final to feel complete. When people ask what revenge looks like, they often expect drama, public takedowns, loud justice, viral moments. But sometimes, the real revenge is quieter. It looks like soft mornings and honest work, Like living fully in a space someone else thought you didn't deserve. Like building something they can't tear down. Not because you beat them, but because you outgrew the need to. I didn't buy the house to hurt him. I bought it to heal me. And that, I've learned, is a story that writes itself long after the credits roll. So, if you're listening and you've been laughed at, pushed out, underestimated by someone who should have known better, I'll ask you this. What's the house next door in your story? And when you find it, will you claim it just to prove a point, or to build something truer, quieter, and completely yours?